Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in his office at SHAEF headquarters, staring at a map that no longer made sense. On the table lay a piece of paper, a report that shouldn't have existed. It was a message from the front lines, but it wasn't a request for supplies or a report on enemy movement. It was a confession of defiance. Across the room, his aides waited. They expected a command. They expected the famous Ike grin or a measured, strategic response. Instead, they got a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of the room. Eisenhower's jaw was set so tight his teeth might have cracked. He didn't look like the Supreme Allied commander in that moment. He looked like a man who had just realized his most powerful weapon had turned its barrel back toward him. What he muttered under his breath in those seconds was never recorded in the official war diaries. It wasn't meant for the history books or the press briefings. It was a raw, unfiltered realization of a betrayal that threatened to unravel the entire liberation of Europe. You think you know the story of the push into Germany? You think you know the rivalry between the calm strategist and the hot-blooded general. But you haven't heard what Eisenhower whispered when the cameras were off. You haven't seen the moment the Great Crusade almost collapsed, not because of the enemy, but because one man decided he was bigger than the war itself. By early 1945, the Allied machine was a masterpiece of clockwork precision. Eisenhower had built a system where every bullet, every gallon of fuel, and every soldier moved according to a grand design. This was the broad front strategy. It wasn't flashy, but it was inevitable. The plan was simple: squeeze the Third Reich from all sides, move in unison, and leave no gaps for a counterattack. On paper, the hierarchy was absolute. Eisenhower gave the orders. SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, was the brain. The generals in the field were the hands, and the most effective hand was the Third Army, led by George S. Patton. At this stage, Eisenhower believed the situation was stable. His maps were updated every hour. Intelligence confirmed that the German defense was brittle. The logistics were calculated down to the last ton of rations. Success wasn't just likely, it was a mathematical certainty. Patton was where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was told, or so the reports said. Eisenhower trusted the system because he had built it to be unbreakable. He viewed his generals like pieces on a chessboard, predictable, controllable, and essential. He believed that even a personality as volatile as Patton's had been successfully harnessed for the greater good. The war was entering its final act, and the script was already written. What none of them realized was how wrong that assumption was. They were looking at the maps, but they weren't looking at the man holding the compass. The first sign of trouble wasn't a roar, it was a discrepancy. A junior officer at headquarters noticed that the Third Army's fuel consumption was spiking. It didn't make sense. According to the standing orders, Patton's forces were supposed to be holding their positions, consolidating their gains, and waiting for the northern flank to catch up. Then the reports stopped lining up entirely. Aerial reconnaissance showed dust clouds where there should have been stationary camps. Radio silence began to fall over key divisions. When SHAEF reached out for clarification, the responses were vague, delayed, or buried in military jargon. One detail in particular stood out: a bridgehead that shouldn't have been taken, a river crossing that wasn't on the schedule. It was a small deviation, a footnote in a massive theater of war. But to a man like Eisenhower, who lived and breathed coordination, it was a flashing red light. He asked for a direct confirmation of Patton's coordinates. And the answer he got back was physically impossible unless the Third Army had ignored every single directive issued in the last 48 hours. One detail didn't match the rest, and in the chaos of a continent-wide advance, it was ignored by the lower levels of command. They assumed it was a clerical error or the fog of war. They didn't want to believe that a senior commander would actively deceive his own supreme leader. That decision to look away, to trust the legend over the data, would haunt them within days. By the time Eisenhower realized the scale of the deviation, it was too late to simply stop it. Patton hadn't just moved a few miles. He had sprinted into territory that was tactically isolated. He had bypassed German strongpoints that were supposed to be neutralized by other units. He was creating a giant, vulnerable bulge in the Allied line, all for the sake of speed and glory. Instead of slowing down when he received frantic clarifications from SHAEF, Patton doubled down. He knew that if he moved fast enough, the facts on the ground would override the orders from the rear. He was gambling with the lives of thousands of men, betting that his momentum would force Eisenhower to change the entire Allied strategy just to save him. The tension at headquarters was reaching a breaking point. Every 90 seconds, it seemed, a new update arrived that pushed the Third Army further from the original plan. Why Eisenhower was faced with a choice that no commander ever wants to make. Do you publicly discipline your most successful general in the middle of a victory, or do you let him hijack the war? When to pull back now would admit something worse than a mistake. It would admit that control was already gone. It would show the world and the enemy that the Allied command was fractured. Eisenhower was being held hostage by the success of his own subordinate. That's when the situation crossed the point of no return. The Great Crusade was no longer a plan. It was a runaway train. This is where the history books get quiet. Publicly, the narrative was one of unprecedented mobility. But behind the closed doors of his private quarters, Eisenhower's composure finally snapped. He wasn't the diplomat anymore. Witnesses, the few who were allowed in his inner circle, recalled a man who was vibrating with a quiet, lethal rage. He didn't scream. He spoke in a low-clipped tone that was far more terrifying. He spoke about the ego of men who would trade the safety of the entire front for a headline in a hometown newspaper. He wrote a letter, not a formal command, but a personal one. The drafts of his correspondence from this period show heavy crossouts and ink blots where the pen pressed too hard against the paper. Like he was wrestling with the realization that Patton wasn't just ignoring orders, he was mocking the very idea of a unified command. In a private moment with his closest confidant, Omar Bradley, Eisenhower said something that would have ended Patton's career instantly if it had been leaked. It wasn't about the tactical error. It was about the character of the man. He suggested that Patton's brilliance was no longer worth the price of his soul, but he didn't say it out loud to the press. Not yet. He had to keep the mask on. He had to pretend this was all part of the plan, even as he looked at Patton's name and saw a threat equal to anything the Germans had left. The fallout was immediate, though invisible to the public. To keep Patton's unsanctioned drive from collapsing, Eisenhower had to divert fuel and supplies from other armies, units that were actually following the plan. This created a domino effect of resentment. British commanders were livid. Other American generals felt betrayed. The human cost was measured in the men who had to hold the gaps Patton left behind. Because the Third Army had moved so fast, their flanks were soft. German units, though retreating, were able to snap back at the overextended lines. Every mile Patton gained for the newsreels was paid for by soldiers in other sectors who suddenly found themselves low on ammunition because the trucks had been rerouted to feed Patton's ego. Orders became reactions. The SHAEF strategy was no longer about a broad, steady advance. It was about frantically plugging holes and praying that the Germans didn't realize how thin the Allied line had actually become. Strategy became survival. The carefully constructed clockwork was now a mess of grinding gears. And this wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Patton knew he had won the internal war. He had proven that he could break the rules and Eisenhower would have no choice but to support him. This wasn't just a dispute over a map or a river crossing. It was the moment Dwight D. Eisenhower realized that power has limits, even when you are the supreme commander. He realized that you can control an army, but you cannot always control the men who lead it. The revelation that Eisenhower kept private was a bitter one, that in the pursuit of a great cause, you often have to tolerate the intolerable. He had to protect the hero image of a man he increasingly viewed as a dangerous liability. He had to lie to the world to keep the alliance together. Patton's defiance didn't lose the war. In fact, many argue it shortened it, but it destroyed the trust that the post-war world was supposed to be built on. It showed that even at the highest levels of human endeavor, personal vanity can override the most meticulously crafted plans. Eisenhower learned that leadership isn't just about making the right decision, it's about managing the consequences of other people's wrong ones. Something was permanently lost in that office at SHAEF, a sense of shared purpose that could never quite be restored. The history books call Patton a genius who understood the tempo of war better than the bureaucrats in the rear. They say Eisenhower was too rigid, are too concerned with logistics over instinct. But look at the cost. Look at the diverted supplies, the angered allies, and the lives spent to cover a general's gamble. Was this the ultimate display of leadership under pressure? Eisenhower swallowing his pride to save the mission? Or was this the exact moment his judgment failed, allowing a subordinate to dictate the terms of the greatest war in history? If you were in that office, holding that report, would you have stripped Patton of his command and risked a public scandal that could have stalled the invasion? Or would you have done what Ike did, stayed silent, supported the man you resented, and let history believe it was all part of the plan? The debate started in that room in 1945, and it has never truly ended. What do you think? Was Patton a savior or a saboteur? Let's get into it in the comments.